Before I get into the intro, I just wanted to kind of a side note here, which it's a side note, but it also really goes along with this morning's message. I saw that movie yesterday called Jesus Revolution, and I'm just going to tell all of you that you should probably go and see it. It was incredible. If you don't know about Jesus Revolution, it's the story of how Calvary Chapel got started, but it's not about that. It's about Chuck Smith, who was the pastor. I don't want to give too much away if you go see it or if you don't know the story, but basically had a kind of a dying church and was during the time of the late 60s, the hippie revolution, and he's looking around going, I don't get it, I don't understand it, but you know, God, if you just give me a hippie, I'll try to understand, right? And sure enough, God does, and then it revolutionizes his ministry. A movement across the country takes place, and they figure out how to reach this group of people that were just seeking for some kind of meaning and purpose. And it's like I posted about it yesterday a little bit, but literally the first half of the movie, you're just like trying to hold back tears. I mean, I was like my eyes were watering. I'm sitting next to my mom and Jade, and I'm just like, I don't want to like wipe it right now because they're gonna know that I'm crying. But like, it was just so powerful, man. Like just to see the attitude of these people and how they didn't allow any barriers or anything in between to reach these people. And it really does have to do with what we're going for. But I have another opening illustration, so I didn't want to change it last minute because I think this one's good too. But I would highly recommend going and seeing that movie and just let it move you and stir in you and lead you to pray for another revolution like that in our country and in our world, really. So it was fantastic. Just wanted to kind of throw that out to you guys if you had considered it or maybe haven't heard about it yet. But great movie. The only weird thing is that the main hippie is Jesus from The Chosen, so it's weird to get past that. Like, it's like, wait, you're supposed to be Jesus, but you're like the hippie, and it's like, I can't do it. All right, cool. So, Mark chapter 2, and we're in verses 13 through 17. Let me ask you this question. Have any of you guys ever seen the website or any of the videos called I Am Second? Do you guys remember that from like 10 years ago, maybe-ish? But the basic concept, I mean, they're pretty incredible videos, but the whole idea behind it is that, of course, you know, Jesus is first, and I am second, you know, which really biblically, it should be I am last, but I digress, okay? But I am second, okay? Jesus is number one. He's priority in my life. And what they do is they get celebrities, athletes, people that would be recognizable, and they have them tell their testimony of when they became a believer. And a lot of it is very moving because maybe they had a history of addiction, or they, materialism, or whatever it was in their life became like the obsession, the idol, and then Jesus radically transformed their life. And one of the more moving ones that I've seen is an old bass player from the band Korn. If you guys were like 90s kids, late 90s, Korn was a pretty big band in the secular realm, not really like horrible songs actually, but they were a huge band. But one of these testimonies of faith is by a guy, their bass player, his name is Brian Welch. It's Brian Head Welch is how he goes, that's his nickname. But in it, he talks about being in this band and touring the world and being crippled by an addiction to crystal meth, and how basically it led to moments where, he would, if you go and watch the video, go to imsecond.com, I think is a website, but like find this guy's video. But talking about how, he had his daughter, and his daughter was running around the house singing his songs while he's, just on drugs in the other room. And he just kind of got to this point, like this is my life. And his real estate broker was sharing a verse with him. Like he said, hey man, this verse really touched me this week. I thought you could really use it. It was, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest, burdened and heavy laden. And so that really spoke to him. And then the real estate guy was inviting him to church. He agreed to go. And like the first time he went, he said, like, yes, this is what I'm missing. This is what I want. And then I won't give the rest of the story away, but like radical transformation. And still living that way today, which is pretty incredible. A lot of times those stories, and then they fall back into it, but he stayed clean, he stayed strong in his faith, and now he's like touring and speaking, and it's really cool. That's him right there, okay? Now, tell me if I'm in high school and I see that dude, I'm like, no way that guy's gonna accept Jesus. Because, I mean, look at him, like, he's too rough. He's too, like tattoos and the long hair and the braids, and, like, there's no way, right? My self-righteous self in high school would have looked at him and go, he's too far gone. He's too far. There's no way that guy's gonna accept Jesus. There's no possible way that's gonna happen. And the beautiful thing about our passage this morning is that we see not, that guy, but we see people who are considered some of the worst in the eyes of the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, and that's who Jesus goes after. That's who Jesus goes and spends his time with. That's who he puts forth the extra effort to share meals with and to sit with and to converse with. And I think it's a really, really powerful thing, and you can, this is why that movie yesterday was such a beautiful picture as well of this being modeled in our modern day. But no one is beyond the love of Jesus. Like, no one is beyond the love of Jesus. No one is too far gone. In fact, those who are on the fringes of society are who we are called to go after and try to share Jesus with. And I mentioned last week that the next 5 weeks, we're going to be talking about these different controversies between Jesus and the religious leaders. And so today, our second controversy that we see is that Jesus eats with sinners. This is the big controversy, is that Jesus eats with sinners. Why is it so controversial? We'll get to that. But first, let's read our passage. Let's read Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. It says, he went out again, talking of Jesus, he went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. So here's our big idea out of that passage this morning, is that the call of Jesus stretches to those who the world has disregarded as outcast. The call of Jesus stretches to those who the world has disregarded as outcasts. And the first point we see coming out of verse 14, let's leave the big ideas for us. It's kind of long. Make sure you guys are getting that. I know sometimes we move on too quickly. But number one is that Jesus calls the outcast. That's the first thing we see, is that Jesus calls the outcast. And this is in verse 14. So Mark has Jesus on the move again, right? We talked about how Mark is a book of action. So Jesus is on the move. He's down by the sea. He's in the same place kind of generally where he picked up Simon and Andrew, James and John off their boats. He's there. The crowds are following him. He's teaching them. We saw that was his purpose, was to come and teach the message of the gospel. And then he passes by a tax booth. And in it we find Levi. Now, it doesn't say he was a tax collector here, but the implication would be that if he's sitting in a tax booth, he's probably a tax collector. And then we learn later that this is Matthew, the tax collector, who wrote the book of Matthew that we have. But I'm going to give you a little history around tax collectors. It's really important that we understand how they were viewed at that time to really understand this big idea of Jesus calling the outcasts. So here's a little history from a historian, biblical historian. He says the tax collectors like Matthew were despised by the Jews because they were a symbol of their subjugation to the Roman government, with whom they were regarded as collaborators. So tax collectors were collaborating with the Romans against their fellow Jews and thus were regarded as traitors. They had significant contact with the Gentile dogs, as they were called, the Romans, and they were patternly dishonest. They didn't hesitate to shake down their fellow Jews and practice out-and-out extortion. So not only did they collect what was due, but they would also collect interest and collect more than what was needed. They were usually lumped in by the Jews into the derogatory category of sinners. This is why you see sinners and tax collectors grouped together. Some rabbinic writings even compared them to murderers and robbers. So the tax collector was considered one of the worst in the eyes of the Jewish leaders. Here's a little bit more. When a Jew entered the customs service, he was regarded as an outcast from society. He was disqualified as a judge or a witness in a court session, and he was excommunicated from the synagogue. And in the eyes of the community, his disgrace extended to his whole family. So not only is he considered a traitor because he's working with the Roman authorities to collect money and to take more than what was due, but also he was disqualified from having any rights in the Jewish community. He wasn't allowed in the synagogue anymore, was not allowed to go sit under the teaching of the Jewish leaders, and even his family was considered disgraced. So they weren't just hated for working with the Romans. They weren't just despised for extortion, but they were excommunicated, they were cut off, they were disregarded, and they were outcast. This is a tax collector, and Jesus walks up to one of them and he says, "Hey, how would you feel about leaving everything behind and following me?" Now, one side note here, I think it's important to note this. Jesus has not yet declared who the 12 disciples are going to be. Right now, he's gathering followers. In fact, in chapter 3 of Mark is when he actually names the 12. He calls the 12 to himself and he says, "You're going to be my 12 that follow me and that I send out." But at this point, he's calling people to come with him. Just come with me. Now, Jesus obviously knows that Matthew's going to become one of the 12. But at this point, he's just calling people to come, follow me, learn from me, listen to my teaching, experience my authority as the Son of God. But here's the point, is that Jesus walks up to the most despised of society. He walks up to the outcast, the man who had been disregarded in his community, in his village, and he invites him into what he is doing. He invites him to be a part of it. He invites him, in effect, to community with him. So it's not that he's like, "Hey, just come tag along." It's, no, I want you to come and be a part of what's going on, right? Follow me is come be a part of something. And it's believed that Levi is the last of the eventual 12 to be called, so Jesus rounds out the 12 disciples with a tax collector, with an outcast, with one who is regarded with murderers and thieves. So let's pause here for a moment, okay? And I need to just let you know something here, okay? I need to let you know that I am eternally grateful that this is true. Like, I mean, literally eternally grateful that this is true, that Jesus shows no partiality to those who he calls. I'm often, and I try when I teach, and it's really, if you know me, it's no surprise that I was in tears at the movie yesterday, because I cry all the time. And I'm always fighting back tears on the stage, and especially when I talk of what Jesus did in my life and what he did for me. So here we go. I'm thankful that no one is too far gone for Jesus to rescue. And this belief, by the way, that's what drove the philosophy with which I did student ministries for the 11 years that I did it. The belief, and I see one of my students nodding, like the belief that no one is too far gone. I'm telling you right now, man, like countless times in student ministries where you're sitting down with kids and, there's like far from God, and then there's like, in our minds, like too far from God, right? And you sit with these kids, and if I would have believed or thought for a second that this kid is just like, why am I wasting or spending my time on this kid? Like, he's too far gone. Then I don't think that I would have seen the spiritual success that we saw in our ministry. Like the buying into that no student is too far is what drove why and how we did what we did. Like, every kid matters. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what you're involved in right now. Like, Jesus still loves you and wants you, and there's room for you in his kingdom. And so we would just love and love and love, because I don't believe in giving up on people. Like, I don't believe in that. You don't give up on people, because nobody is too far gone. It doesn't matter what they've done. It doesn't matter how far they might appear. It doesn't matter how far they are. No one is beyond the reach of the love of Jesus. And so as we get into the next few points, it's so important to lock that in. It's so important to have that on the forefront of our mind, that nobody is too far gone. And maybe there are people that you know. Maybe someone comes to mind when you go, yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I hear you, but I don't know. Like you talk about far gone. I know people who are far gone. So maybe there's someone that comes to your mind, and yeah, there's no hope, or they seem hopeless, but we are called to love them just like Jesus did in this passage. Those who seemed like there was no hope, the outcasts of society. And now I'm gonna give you a fair warning here. Before we just get there. But the very end of the message today, I want you to be thinking of those people, because the very end of the message, we're going to pray together. We're going to get in our little small groups, and we're going to pray by name for the people that come to your mind, come to your heart, who don't know Jesus, who you feel compelled to invite into your life. So just wanted to throw that out there so you're aware of it, because I know some people don't love that part of the service when we do that, but I also want to give you just a warning. But let's move on. All right, so we see Jesus calling the outcasts. Number two, we see that Jesus eats with the outcasts. That Jesus eats with the outcasts. Look again, verse 15. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. So it's important to look at these words and to really think about what was going on in this moment. So Levi is so overcome by the compassion of Jesus towards him. He's so overwhelmed by the person of Jesus that he invites all his friends over to meet him. This is taking place in Levi's house. This is Levi's house where it's happening. He invites all his friends over. In fact, in Luke 5:29, it tells us that Levi made a great feast in his house. And we got to paint this picture for you to understand really how beautiful it is when it says that Jesus reclined at table. Because I think we often think of, like, when you sit down and eat, we have the famous painting of the Last Supper, right? And we have this big banquet table, and they're all sitting there together, and that's not even close to how it was. So not to ruin that depiction for you, it's a beautiful painting, but that's not actually how they would have eaten meals. So what does it mean that Jesus reclined, right? I think, I tend to go, well, they sat in their chair and kicked the feet up and, all right, let's recline and, share some. That's not reclining either, right? But when they shared a meal together and they reclined, it meant that the meal had turned into an intimate setting of breaking bread together. Why? Go to I'm going to show you this picture, okay? It's really weird. But this picture here shows what it meant to recline. So you have the table in the middle, the mesa, and then those are people, and you can see the little blue rectangles, that's a pillow, and I'm not going to do it on the stage, but they would lay on their side, and they would lay with their head at the table and their feet towards the wall. That's how they would recline and eat together. So this is cultural. This is there's other, maybe they kneeled at a table or sat sometimes. When it got intimate and long, and it was a longer situation, a longer meal, they would recline and lay down and relax. So they would have their head by the table. Usually the guest of honor would be right in the middle of it all. So Jesus would have been on the left, 3 up. That would have been Jesus. And then next to him would have been the guests of honor, the closest to him. So think about that for a minute. Think about how intimate that is. One, you're so relaxed that you're laying on your side, but you're literally right next to each other, and your heads are all around the table, and you're just talking, and you're eating, and you're sharing a meal together, right? That's what it meant to recline at the table. And this is what Jesus was doing. So, again, Last Supper, great, but it would have looked more like that. It would have been a U shape, would have been around 3 walls with these massive couches, and they would have been laying down on their sides, reclining together, eating a meal. Now, let's not miss this, okay? In the first century, right, it's intimate already, but in the first century, breaking bread with somebody was a sign of acceptance and friendship. So not only is Jesus eating a meal, but what that's telling the cultural, the people that are there, the religious leaders, what it's telling them is that Jesus was accepting these people in relationship as friends. Those who were considered the worst of the worst, Jesus said, yeah, but I'm a friend to sinners. And I'm going to share a meal with you. And it's going to be an intimate setting where we're loving each other, and we're eating together, and we're talking together. And this is what he did. And so you wonder then, you don't wonder seeing this. You go, man, no wonder the Pharisees were angry. right? He's a rabbi. He's a teacher. You're not supposed to, one, even like associate with sinners, but to recline and share a meal with them at a sinner's house? Like, what is happening right now, right? And this is where the controversy comes in. This man claims to be this. He claims to be a teacher. He claims to be a rabbi. People are following him, and he's using that influence to eat with sinners? I mean, who is this man? Who does he think that he is, right? But just picture this. Jesus, the creator of the universe, God in flesh, inviting the sinner to feast at the table with him. And what a picture of what's to come, right? Revelation 19, 6-9 says, I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters and like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. So Jesus, reclining at table with sinners, is a picture also of what's to come when Christ and his church are married together and there is a great feast in heaven, like reclining at table. Sinners saved by grace, reclining at table with Jesus, sharing a meal at this massive banquet. Like, that's what we have to look forward to. So this is a current, like, in that time reality, but it's also a future reality of what's to come. And we get to share, like, think about that. We get to sit at a table with Jesus. Like, does that blow you away? Why? Because he invites the sinner to himself. I read this book years ago, and I picked it back up this week in light of this passage. It's just called Eats with Sinners. It's a really good book, and it offers, oftentimes we talk about, okay, well, that's great, we're going to get to this point here in a little bit, but like, okay, so I have someone in my life, but I don't really know where to start. I don't know what to say. And this book is really good because it gives you just really practical ways to reach people. It's called Eats with Sinners. But in this book, he talks about the hows, right? Not, yes, the whys, but more about the hows. But here's what he says. He says, we are faithful in meeting with other saints on a regular basis around the Lord's table, but are we faithless in our refusal to meet with lost people around theirs? I mean, let that sink in for a second, right? We are faithful to share a meal with other believers. I would say probably for most of us, right? When you share a meal, I mean, I'm not going to speak for everyone in here, but I would just venture a guess that most of the time it's with other believers. It's with people who you've connected with at church. Maybe there's kids' friends at school, and there's other Christians, and so you share a meal, you go hang out together, and that's important, and we should do that. Like, that's really necessary for our Christian lives. But when I read that second line, are we faithless in our refusal to meet with lost people around their table? In other words, do we really believe that God can do something in those relationships? Do I believe that I can be used in those relationships to meet those people? And I think it really does beg that question, how much time are we spending around the table with people who don't know Jesus? How often do you break bread with unbelievers? Not how often do you talk to them, but we all know this, like sharing a meal with someone takes the relationship to another level. There's something powerful in eating a meal together. It seems to break down barriers, and people are more open to conversations across the table. And maybe those conversations aren't had otherwise. And so it's a really important way that we can reach them. And it's a really hard, maybe necessary challenge for us this morning to consider that as well. Let's move into point 3, and we're going to get back to this here in a moment. But let's move on to point 3, is that Jesus challenges the self-righteous. Jesus challenges the self-righteous in verses 16 and 17, and this is where the Pharisees kind of call him out a little bit. But curiosity and anger is what really drove the Pharisees to follow Jesus as well, right? Like, they're almost everywhere that Jesus is, some religious leader, whether it's scribes, whether it's Pharisees, eventually Sadducees, like whoever it is, there's always religious leaders around, right? They're curious. They're eventually judgmental, which we see here. They're angry, but they still are curious. It's kind of a weird dynamic. Now, they weren't at the meal. They weren't sitting at the meal eating, but probably were outside the house, probably in the doorway or looking through the window. They're observing this happen. They probably hear it. If you guys are, walking down your neighborhood street and there's a party going on in someone's house and, you're kind of sitting on the sidewalk like, oh, I wish I was in there. But like you hear it happen, and there's conversations, there's music, So they were observing this happening, and as they're watching it take place, Jesus, who's a Jewish rabbi, sharing a meal with these sinners. Of course, the Pharisees didn't look at themselves as such, as sinners, but for them, a sinner was someone who was known for moral wickedness and consequent exposure to divine displeasure. That's how it was defined. Moral wickedness, consequent exposure to divine displeasure. In other words, God is never happy with these people. For the Pharisees, the sinner was the one who didn't obey the law as they interpreted it. So that was really troublesome for them. So Jesus either overhears the conversation outside the doors, or one of his disciples runs to him and tells him, I'm not sure how it happened, we're not told. But in all of his wisdom, of course, he says, listen, if you're healthy, right, if you think you're healthy, then what are you so worried about? You don't need me, right? If you're good, if you're righteous, then you don't need someone to come and help you. So what are you so concerned about? But those who are sick are the ones who need a doctor, right? Those who are sinners, as you call them, need someone to save them. But you righteous, right? It's almost like it's not tongue-in-cheek, but it's almost like maybe it kind of is, but he's like, you're righteous, right? Like, you're the righteous ones, so why, you don't need me. And, they're sitting there like, yeah, you're right. Like, we are the righteous ones. But who needs me, right? The people who I'm here with, the sinners, the outcasts, those who have been disregarded, the ones who appear far from God, those are the ones who need me. They're the ones who need help. That's the reason that I came, right? I came so that those who were without hope, those who were lost, those who had been pushed to the outside, those who have denied God, and those who are living in sin, like, I came for them. And he's calling out their self-righteousness. He's calling out this nose turned up attitude towards these sinners. They think they are worthy. They think they don't need any help. But it's the one who understands their need, who understands that they have no leg to stand on before God. Those are the ones who Jesus goes after. And Jesus is going to butt heads with these religious leaders so many times, right? It's going to be constant from this point forward because of their attitude. Because of their, I don't need you, I am righteous by following the law attitude. I don't need help. And then that leads, of course, to disbelief, right? It leads to the hardness of their hearts. And does he want these Pharisees to accept him? Of course he does. Like, he died for all. But he also knows that the hardness of their hearts is going to continue to be an issue moving forward, and his time is limited. Right, he's got about 3.5 years of ministry on this earth once he begins his ministry. And he knows there's a lot of people that need him and that are going to be open to him. And he recognizes that need, and those are the ones that he goes after. So does it seem like he disregards the religious leaders? It does seem like that. Do I believe that he wants that all would be saved? Yes, I do. But he's going to spend his time with those who recognize their need for a Savior, who don't think that they're too good, who don't think that they're too righteous, that don't think that they're worthy. And this is, for us, like, I kind of alluded to my self-righteousness, but I was that self-righteous kid. And the crazy thing about it, if you knew me in high school, like, I was not righteous at all. Like, my lifestyle was not righteous at all, but I still was like, well, I go to church, and I play on the worship team, and I go on mission trips, and how dare you go to Young Life, because they don't know what they're talking about. And I'm like, but like, literally, that was my attitude. Was like, oh, all these, like, they smoke, they drink, they go to R-rated movies, right? Like, those are the kids going to Young Life. Yeah, let them have them, right? I'm too good for Young Life. Like, literally, that was my attitude. Just like self-righteous, and I was like the worst of them all. I didn't even recognize that I was the one who needed Jesus. And so if we're not careful, we get into this mode of like, I'm focusing on me, I'm focusing on me, I'm focusing on me. And then we tend to turn the other way when we see someone that may actually need Jesus, right? Like the picture I showed you of that guy. Like, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands, but if you're like walking down the street and you see someone like that, and then you see somebody else that looks like maybe a little bit more normal, you're probably going to walk up to the normal person and start a conversation more over the guy who's like decked out in black, tattoos everywhere, long braids with like eye makeup, right? That's just kind of what we do. But instead, Jesus is going, no, man, go after that guy. Go talk to that guy, right? I mean, and by the way, like these days, the best of Christians are tatted up, and some of them wear eye makeup. It's whatever, okay? But you know what I'm saying. So let's kind of get to our application point, okay? So in this movie yesterday, in Jesus Revolution, this pastor Chuck Smith, he made a decision to open up his home and his church to those who were far from Jesus. He made a decision. In fact, a lot of them lived with him for a time. Like literally opened his home to them. Opened the doors of his church. And there were even some in his church that refused to do that and ended up leaving because of it. But the thing that started the whole movement was his willingness to invite those who many had disregarded as outcasts into his home and into his life. Right? This is a generation of people that nobody understands, nobody wants to understand. They're out there, they're literally like all day, they're on drugs, it's love and peace and all that kind of stuff, right? I'm going to find purpose in drugs and in other things in the culture. Now, I said this already, but our relationship with each other is like very important. Okay, so let's not disregard that. It's very important to be connected to other believers. That's the most important, in fact, I would say, because it's life-giving, it's accountability, there's shared faith, there's shared spirit, and that's needed and necessary, and it's commanded of us to be in community with one another. So that is like, don't forsake that. Have meals with people who are other believers. That's very important. However, if those are the only people that we're doing life with, then something has to change. Our thinking has to change. We have to believe that Jesus wants us to invite those people that don't know him into our lives. And that doesn't just mean a conversation, which I was thinking about this, writing it down, but it made me feel kind of old. Like, do they still have water coolers at workplaces? Do they still have like you meet at the water cooler? Is that like still a thing? Like, I'll have a conversation at the water cooler. I don't know. It just seems kind of old school. But like, wherever it kind of, okay. Wherever the place to meet, like that's great. Have a conversation with someone, that's great. But inviting them into your life, inviting them into your home, that's far different than having a conversation at work or at your kid's sporting event or at the school or whatever. Like, those are important steps. But really what we're getting at here and what Jesus is getting at is, no, you got to get a little bit deeper than that. You got to be a little more intentional than that. It's got to be a little bit more intimate than that conversation that happens. We've got to pursue those relationships with people. We've got to have them into our homes, and we've got to get into their homes too. Meet them for coffee or lunch, right? Sit across the table from them. Invite them over to watch the game, whatever game it is that you watch. Invite them over to play the game, whatever game you play. Like, we love family game nights. Like, invite them over to play on family game night, right? Like, have some other couples over. Leave the kids at home, get a sitter, and if it's a married couple, like, go have a double date with them. Go out to dinner. Like, you're gonna do those things anyways. So start prioritizing relationships with people that don't yet know Jesus. Why? Because nobody is too far gone, right? Nobody's too far gone that Jesus can't reach. And we, guys, listen, we've been left on this earth for this purpose, right? What was Jesus' commission to his disciples and those who were gathered at his ascension? Or right before, what does he say? Go and make disciples. Go and make disciples. Right? That starts in your home. We're commanded to do that if we have kids. Make disciples in your home, but go, like, be moving. There's movement. Continue to go and make disciples. Like, get out there and make disciples. So the question is, like, if I'm not doing that, why am I even here? What's the point of walking this earth if I'm not making disciples as a Christian? And I would say this like sometimes, and then I would kind of go, wait a minute, don't say that, Adam, because I'm like, Jesus, take me home if I'm not doing that. And then I'm like, wait, am I doing that? Don't take me home. Give me another chance. Well, no, I want to go home actually, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like if I'm not doing that on this earth, what is the point? That's what we have been left here to do. Listen, I really do believe, and we're gonna get in our little prayer groups here in a minute, but like I really do believe that if we live this way, that if we prioritize, yes, relationships with other believers, but if we then place a high priority on those who don't know Jesus and like we're pouring into those relationships, it's going to make a radical difference in our lives. It's going to make a radical difference in our church. It's going to make a radical difference in our homes. Like if you have kids and you're modeling this for your kids, like that's a powerful thing for them as they grow up, right? Like to show them that, man, we love everybody. We love people that go to church. We love people that don't go to church. We love people that love Jesus. We love people that don't know Jesus. Like that example for them is so powerful. And I do really believe that it's going to be a radical transformation in your life and in our church if we live that way. But it has to start with prayer. It has to start with prayer. I believe that prayer, everything has to start with prayer. Any decision, any movement in our lives, any change that we make has to start with prayer. So we're going to do that this morning. And it's going to be very simple. I'm not going to have prayer points on the screen because it's very simple. What I'm going to ask is, as I was preaching and as we're talking through this and as we're looking at how Jesus interacted, hopefully the Holy Spirit brought someone to your mind. Hopefully there's someone in your life. Listen, it could be a family member even. It doesn't have to be a coworker. It could be a neighbor. But somebody who doesn't know Jesus, and it doesn't have to be the one that seems way too far. Like maybe you don't have that person in your life, and that's okay. But everybody knows somebody that doesn't know Jesus. And I was praying before service, and I wasn't praying while I was talking because I'm not very good at multitasking. But like, I really believe that the Holy Spirit probably brought someone to your mind. So what I'm going to ask you to do is we're gonna stand. We're gonna just have my dad's just gonna play some keys behind me, just to kind of so it's not dead silent. I know sometimes that can be awkward when you're trying to pray out loud, but we're just gonna stand, gather in groups 3, 4, or 5, and just share the name. You don't have to give context. You don't have to say this is someone from work or someone who is my neighbor or someone from my kid's school or someone like my family. You don't have to give context. Okay, just give the name. And then just spend a couple of minutes just praying for two things. One, for those in your group to have the confidence, the boldness, the opportunities to create those opportunities, but pray for that person also. So pray for the one who mentioned that they would have the opportunities and have the boldness to invite them into their life, but also pray by name for those people. Pray that the Lord would use whoever it is in your group that names them, that they would use them to reach these people. Pray that they would be changed by the gospel. Pray that they would be reached with the gospel and that they would come to know Jesus for the first time. And if you want to go even to this point, like, pray they come to Family Church. No, pray they get plugged in at a church, right? Like, pray that they find a community of believers. Doesn't have to be here, but somewhere to plug in, to find community and to grow in their faith. Take it to that level if you want. But let's just take a couple of minutes, stand up, find a few people around you, and just, could be one name, could be two, could be three. Just throw some names out of who the Lord brought to your mind, and then I'll come up and close us in prayer after that.